io comincio con qualche commento di ringraziamento, anche chiedendo scusa del mio pessimo italiano, non è proprio l'accento fiorentino, quello mio. Comincio con ringraziare Sergio Fabbrini, un vecchio amico, per quelle bellissime parole. Devo dire che io sono un credente nei numeri, perciò mi ha piaciuto il riferimento ai numeri riguardante la mia citazione e la citazione di Tocqueville, ma questo mi pare quasi una prova della inutilità dei numeri in qualche caso. Non credo che io sono a quel livello. Devo anche precisare che è vero che vengo molto all'albergo Raffaele e da dove è cominciato questa nostra ricerca, ma io sono del Raffaele pre-Bettino. Voglio anche utilizzare queste occasioni per ringraziare altri amici italiani che mi hanno insegnato tutto per quanto riguarda l'Italia e anche per quanto riguarda la politica. Alcuni non sono qui: Sabino Cassese, Joseph La Palabara, Giorgio Napolitano. Qualcuno di questi avrete sentito parlare. Gianfranco Pasquino, Romano Prodi, il defunto e caro Alberto Sprefico, altri sono qui, forse il più anziano in termini di serietà, io non parlo di età, ma anzianità, è il vecchio amico, non vecchio, il caro amico Andrea Sprefico. Andrea Mansella, scusate, Andrea Mansella. Ed altri miei partner qui, Bob Lenardi, Raffaele Nanetti, Franco Pavoncello, Leonardo Merlino che sta qui, il nostro equipe ormai non più giovane, ma che era una volta giovane. E chiedo scusa anche agli altri che inevitabilmente ho dimenticato per questa crescente debolezza di memoria. Soprattutto sono grato a Luis, al suo rettore e ad altri colleghi di questa istituzione molto nuova, ma ormai adesso una delle più importanti istituzioni sullo studio dei governi e della politica in Europa e nel mondo. Il tema dei miei commenti questa mattina è che c'è di novità nel capitale sociale per quanto riguarda gli Stati Uniti e forse anche altri paesi. Adesso, 10 anni dopo Bowling Alone, il mio studio sul declino della società civile negli Stati Uniti, e quasi 20 anni dopo la pubblicazione del nostro libro sulle regioni italiane, io voglio toccare anche brevemente 4 temi, cioè 4 aspetti di questa novità. Prima, good news. E adesso parlerò in inglese, se mi permettete. I want to talk about 4 themes, 4 new things about social capital and about democracy in the United States and possibly in other countries. First, there is good news, and it involves youthful civic renewal in America. Secondly, I want to say a word about the challenge of religion that Sergio has referred to. Thirdly, I want to say a word about the challenge of immigration, which is a challenge in my country and also in Europe. And fourthly, I want to talk about a challenge about which I am actually pessimistic. I'm optimistic about most other aspects of modern society, and I'm optimistic about the prospects for democracy in America and in other countries, but with one important exception, and that is the growth of inequality. And so I'm going to say something in the fourth theme that I want to touch on is the issue of inequality. So briefly, the good news. It's better to begin with good news. In the book Bowling Alone, I and my colleagues traced a steady 40-year decline in measures of senso civico, in measures of interest in public affairs and interest in the common welfare among successive American generations. Each year, from the middle 1960s until 2000, our graphs showed declining interest in and commitment to public life and the public interest among American young people. In the fall of 2000, suddenly those numbers turned up. And those numbers among recent young people, today's young people, have been going up for the last 10 years in America. It's a very sharp, I almost wish I had brought PowerPoint because the graph looks just like that. It's a very sharp change in the year 2000. Of course, that's an interesting question. What could explain the change? I think perhaps the most obvious explanation is that in the year 2000, I published Bowling Alone. And therefore, I probably personally am responsible for the revival of American democracy. But of course, like any good social scientist, I would consider other possible hypotheses. And there were other things happening in the year 2000 besides the publication of Bowling Alone. And of course, the most obvious is 9/11. And if you examine, as we do all the time, tendencies toward measures of civic engagement and social capital, for all Americans, at the moment and just after the attacks of 9/11, there was a sharp increase in all forms of connection in America. I'm sure if we had a national hug index, that would have been very high after 9/11. But for most American adults, people my age or even younger than me, most American adults, the duration of that increase in connection after 9/11 was 6 weeks. And by 6 months later, it was gone. Except for young people. People who had been caught in their most impressionable years, who were still forming their impressions of society at the time of this event, were marked permanently. And that generation, which we call the 9/11 generation, is still much more civically interested and open than their older brothers and sisters, 10 or 15 or 20 years older than them. Obama mania, this amazing event of 2008, was the consequence of that 9/11 generation, not the cause. Obama has great political skill, and he knew about this increase in youthful enthusiasm, and he fed it, he encouraged it, and he's now part of the explanation. But he did not cause it. It was caused earlier. And he knows, and I know, even before the campaign of 2008, that there was this army of young people who wanted to get involved, who had been motivated by a sense of patriotism and a sense of, in some sense, national pride, not pride in the attacks and not hatred of the enemy, but a sense that the events of 9/11 themselves showed that Americans would help one another. It was a very, what teachers call teachable moment, the sense that immigrant waiters and Jewish bankers and Irish and Italian Vigili del Fuoco were all cooperating together. That was a very inspiring moment. I mean, I know it's also involves terrorism and then got involved with Iraq and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the moment of American response, which was a source of pride. There's a little bit of that. I don't want to start commenting now on contemporary American life, but there was a little bit of that you saw after the death of Osama bin Laden. It was not, I think, a matter of bloodlust. It was that's those same young people who had a sense of we as Americans can do things. I'm not trying to defend. I'm certainly not trying to defend the killing of Osama bin Laden. I'm only trying to have you see that there is this young generation in America who are ready and willing, and I think will be able to reverse the bowling alone trend. Of course, it will take time. And of course, it depends on what we, the other adults in the society, do. If we don't cooperate with that young spirit, we could extinguish that fire. But I'm hopeful. That's an important sign of hope. That's the first theme. But now I want to turn to several darker themes, potentially darker themes. I want to say a word about religion, and I'm now going to summarize in a few minutes the main themes of a book that we published last year called American Grace. It's a book of 673 pages. I don't recommend that you try to read it in an evening. And I'm going to summarize it in just a few minutes. Because the crucial story that we tell, this book is an attempt to, it's an ambitious book. It's a book that attempts to describe the changing role of religion in American society over the last 50 years. And there have been two important changes in the role of religion in America over the last 50 years. The background, and I'll say what the two changes are in a second, but the background is that religion, as Tocqueville said, can be a very powerful force for democracy. And we offer some evidence of that in our book. There can be really important, powerful benefits from religion for civil society and democracy. But any quick glance around the world today or through history says that religion, taken in high doses, can be fatal to democracy, can be toxic to civil society. And Americans do take religion in high doses. So the question is are the benefits of religion to American society, do they outweigh the costs or the potential costs? And there have been two important trends in America in religion over the last 50 years that are relevant in this context. First, Americans have become much more polarized in religious terms over the last 50 years. More Americans now than 50 years ago are very religious, and you know about this because you read about these odd American evangelicals and so on that are very, very religious. And more Americans are very not religious. And there are fewer Americans in the middle. So Americans have moved toward the extremes, either very religious or very not religious. And moreover, where you stand, where you are, how religious you are, is now correlated with your politics. So that the more religious you are now, the more likely you are to be conservative and vote Republican. And the more secular you are, the more likely you are to be Democratic. To European audiences, that doesn't seem surprising. In fact, you probably think it's always been true. It has not always been true. Religion has historically been more often a progressive force than a conservative force in America. There is no important progressive social movement in American history that does not have deep religious roots. The American Revolution itself, the egalitarian aspects of the American Revolution, all men are created equal, that came out of a religious revival of the 17th and 18th centuries. The anti-slavery movement of the of the 19th century came directly out of an evangelical movement. Now, I'm not saying that all religious people in America were against slavery. There were some, some bad apples, some not very liberal people who were in church too. But the basic force of the abolition movement, that is the basic force of the movement to end slavery in America, was religious. The women's suffrage movement depended upon powerful religious movements in America. The progressive social eras, the so-called progressive era, that is the period in American history when we passed the most extensive social legislation, came out of religion in the first place. Some of you are old enough to remember the American Civil Rights Revolution, which came out of the churches in America. So the period that we're just entering now is unusual in American history. It's unusual in America, though perhaps not in Europe, to have the religious end of the spectrum be so conservative and the secular end of the spectrum, and the progressive part of the spectrum be so secular. That's unusual. And my prediction is that will not persist. It's an unusual period in American history. But what it means is that in public terms, over the last 30 or 40 years, Americans have become more divided in religious terms. Not only more divided between Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and so on, but also more divided between religion and non-religion. That's the public sphere. And that is probably the part of the American religious story that you're familiar with. The part that you may be less familiar with is that at this same time, during these same years, in our private lives, Americans were busily constructing personal ties across all these religious barriers. So, for example, the rate of intermarriage across religious lines has gone vertically high during this period. Of the marriages now being performed in America, today's new marriages in America, more than half are interfaith marriages, marriages between people from different faith backgrounds. More than half. So the marriage, I don't know if you know about the recent British marriage, the royal couple. I don't know if you about last year we had a royal marriage in America. Hillary Clinton got married. It had almost Chelsea Clinton. Actually, Hillary Clinton's been married a long time. Chelsea Clinton got married. She was raised as a Methodist, a Protestant. He's Jewish. And in the intense public conversation about this, nobody even noticed that. 50 years ago, that would have been all anyone would have talked about. How could this Christian Protestant marry a Jew? Or how could this Jew marry... But now it's completely normal, literally normal. And 40% of all Americans are themselves now worshiping in a tradition other than their own parents. And growing numbers of Americans' best friends, their most intimate friends, are from some other religion. We asked people to tell us about what in American cultural jargon we would call their go-to friends, the friends they would go to if they had cancer or their marriage was some serious personal problem. And then we asked about the religion of those 5 go-to friends, the 5 most intimate friends. Think about your own friends. Half of the average American's most intimate friends are in some other religion. They're Catholic and their friends are Protestant or Jewish or secular or something. What that means is that in the personal lives of Americans, just in the period when in public terms we've been fighting endlessly these culture wars about religion, in our private lives, we now all love someone who's in a different religion. I mean literally, personally love someone among our circle of closest friends and relatives. So what that means is that all Americans nowadays have an Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan fra Regolette, questa zia Susanna is of some other religion than me. I'm Jewish and she's Protestant, or I'm Protestant and she's Catholic, or I'm Catholic and she's Muslim, or I'm Muslim and she's none. And I know that my Faith tells me that poor Aunt Susan, she doesn't worship at the right altar. She's not going to be saved or go to heaven. But on the other hand, do you know Aunt Susan? Aunt Susan, I'm telling you, Aunt Susan is a wonderful human being. If anyone's going to heaven, it's Aunt Susan. I'm not sure whether I'm going to heaven, but Aunt Susan is. So all Americans are caught in this tension between what they say formally on Sunday morning, my way or the highway, it's just Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the light, except through me there's no salvation. And there are a lot of Bible-believing Christian Americans who every Sunday morning say that. There's only one way to heaven. But then when you ask them, as we do, well, how could someone who's a good person, not of your faith, still go to heaven? 80 or 90% of the most religious Americans say yes. And then we said to them, because we thought maybe they were saying maybe that was a few Methodists saying that a couple of Catholics might be able to get into heaven. So we said, are you sure? Do you mean that non-Christians can go to heaven? Now remember, these are Bible-believing. Literally, they believe every word in the Bible. And we said, do you believe that non-Christians can go to heaven? And there's a right answer to that question, and they get that question wrong. They say, sure, Aunt Susan's going to make it. And so what I'm trying to say is, those personal ties have had the effect of making Americans much more open-minded about people of other religions or of no religion at all in the same period that publicly we've been fighting. And so America's good fortune, in a way, is that we get some of the benefits of religion. If this were longer, if we had more time, I know we don't. If we had more time, I'd also present you some of the evidence from our research that religious people actually are nicer than secular people. I would say that partly to provoke you, because I think probably most of you don't believe that that's true, but in America, religious people are much more likely to, and this is all scientifically verified, people who go to church more often are more likely to give money, and not just to churches, but more likely to give money to secular causes than secular people are. They're more likely to volunteer, 3 times more likely to volunteer, and not just for religious charities, but also for secular charities. They're more likely to give blood. Religious people are more likely to let someone cut in front of them in line. Religious people are more likely to give money to beggars. Religious people are more likely to help old ladies across the street. Religious people, in many ways, are just more generous, more altruistic. But I realized that it was going to be difficult for me to persuade you of that without showing you lots of graphs and charts, and I don't want to do that now. I'm only trying to say religion in America has some benefits. I'm actually not deeply religious myself, and I'm not trying to convert you. Please don't think that this is an effort to evangelize this room. I'm only saying that as a social scientist, religion has some benefits. It has some serious potential costs. See Belfast, or Bosnia, or Beirut, or Baghdad, or Bombay. But because of these personal ties, what you call the porosity, the permeability of our religious communities, America that has, even though we're fighting in public, in private we are surprisingly tolerant. The third challenge that I want to talk about will be perhaps seem less strange to you and more familiar to you in this country, and that's the challenge of immigration. In our research about 6 or 8 years ago, we discovered, and it was not a happy discovery, I have to say. I'm a liberal in American terms, a progressive, but we discovered that people react to new ethnic diversity and to immigration in a way that is not good for social capital. The more ethnically diverse the neighborhood that an American lives in, holding constant many other things, so we're focusing just on the ethnic composition of the neighborhood, the more ethnically diverse the neighborhood, the more Americans hunker down, the less they trust anybody. Whites trust blacks less in more diverse neighborhoods. Whites trust whites less. Whites trust whites less in more diverse neighborhoods. Blacks trust blacks less. Everybody trusts everybody less. People are much less likely to volunteer or to give to philanthropy or to know their neighbors or to help their neighbors. The only two things that rise, that increase, as the diversity of your neighborhood increases, are television watching and protest marches. So Americans, in the presence of new ethnic diversity, tend to hunker down, to pull in. Ethnic diversity, it seems, in America, and now there's research on this in other countries too, suggesting the same thing may be true in other countries. Ethnic diversity brings out the turtle in all of us. Now, if I stop the story there, and some people who've read my work on immigration stop at that point, you would think Putnam is now arguing for ethnic cleansing. He's arguing for for ethnic homogeneity. He's arguing against immigration. I'm not. I have to say that when we published this, some of the leading racists in the world suddenly discovered the quality of my research. And so the head of the Ku Klux Klan in America, the Ku Klux Klan in America is very modern. They have a website. On the website, for a while, was a picture of me as the person who proved that race mixing didn't work. And I have to say, I still get regularly letters from some of your, some Italians, some of your connationals, from the very, very, very far right, who say, "Thank you, Professor Putnam. You may not understand the sins of the meridionali," because they think that I actually am understanding of the South, "but at least you understand that questi immigrati sono," I won't repeat what they are. But I didn't stop the story there, because this research on immigration goes on to say, over the long run, and this is now, I'm now actually trying to lecture not to you, but to the broader European public. Immigration is crucial, is a crucial advantage for any modern society. Any modern society that learns how to be a good immigrant nation will succeed. Any modern society, including this one, that does not learn how to be a good immigrant society, how to welcome immigrants and integrate immigrants, will not be a successful society or economy going forward. Immigration is crucial to the future of all of our countries, and the most certain prediction you can make about any modern society, about Finland and about Japan and about Australia and about the United States and about Italy, is that it will be more ethnically diverse 20 years from now than it is now. And that's basically a good thing, because places that are more diverse benefit from the creativity of the immigrants. The vast majority of American Nobel Prize winners are immigrants or children of immigrants. The most creative artists in America are immigrants or children of immigrants. I don't need to say that to an Italian audience, because you're aware of the enormous contribution. This is not just diplomatic language. The seriously enormous contribution that Italian immigrants have made to the United States. If you remove Italian immigrants from the United States, we are a much poorer country. But in the short run, immigration is difficult. It's not easy. That's the point of my research. And the ancestors of the current Italian Americans, that is, the first Italian immigrants to the United States, knew perfectly well that it was not easy. It was not easy to be an immigrant, and it was not easy to be accepted as an immigrant. And a successful immigration society does not expect the immigrants to become like us. A successful immigration society creates a new us, a sense of identity that includes the gifts and talents and values and experiences of the immigrants. It wasn't that we forced all of the Italians to stop liking opera in order to become American. It's that a taste for opera was incorporated into our sense of what it meant to be American. Americans have as you know, this what we call hyphenated Americans. We have lots and lots of Americans who are Italian Americans, or Jewish Americans, or Russian Americans, or Mexican Americans, and that reflects a synthesis of the cultures of the immigrants and the cultures of the home society. And the reason I'm saying this with such passion is that I believe the current debate in Europe about immigration is badly mistaken. It poses the choice, should we have the immigrants lead a separate existence? This is an interpretation of multiculturalism. They do their thing. We have a place for the Pakistanis to live, and they can do their thing. And then we have a place for the Tunisians to live, and they can do their thing. That's the so-called multicultural option, which was popular in Europe in the 1990s, but now is less popular. Or should they become like us? Should we expect all of those Tunisians or Pakistanis or whatever to become like us? The British citizenship test, one of the questions on the British citizenship test not long ago was, what do English people have for lunch on Sunday? And the right answer, of course, is roast beef. Come on, is that the right answer for Hindus? Of course not. It's to imply that you have to become exactly like us. Actually, I'm conscious of the time, but can I tell one story on myself? Not long ago, I was in London. The Queen heard I was in London, and so she invited me to Buckingham Palace. That probably happens to you all the time. Every time you go to London, the Queen invites you to Buckingham Palace. It was rare for me. Actually, she didn't invite me personally. She said to the Prime Minister, every week the Queen has a meeting with the Prime Minister. She said to the Prime Minister, what's this social capital stuff? And what's Putnam? What do I hear about Putnam? And he said, well, I don't know, but I've got someone from my office in number 10 Downing Street knows Putnam. Why don't we have Putnam come to Buckingham Palace? And so I went, knocked on the door, went into Buckingham Palace. I know this sounds boring to you because it happens all the time, but it's rare for an American to get invited to Buckingham Palace. And she missed the appointment. I'm sure it just didn't get into her diary. But all of the other senior officials, the whole other senior staff of the palace was there. If any of you have seen this movie, The Queen, which there are a lot of senior people they were all there. They were there, and I was sitting on this side. And Sir Robin said to me, Professor Putnam, welcome to Buckingham Palace. I said, thank you. And he said, we've invited you here because we would like to know what should be the social capital strategy of the royal family. I felt like I died and gone to heaven. I mean, here I am, the Queen wants to know about the social capital strategy. So I had thought very carefully about that question, and I told them, and I do believe this, that the most important challenge facing Britain today is how to build a multi-ethnic society, an immigration-friendly society. And so I said that to them. I said, I think that this fact that there are a lot of non-normal, non-traditional English people who are now living here is an important social capital problem. And I've noticed that dynasties, royal families, often, when dealing with the problem of making alliances, use the institution of marriage. And so the key element, I think, in the social capital strategy of the royal family should be to find a nice Bangladeshi girl for one of the princes. Dead silence. Not a word was said. We talked a little bit more, and then I left, and I have not been invited back to Buckingham Palace, and as you will have noticed recently, they did not take my advice. And as we were leaving Buckingham Palace, my friend from number 10 said to me as we were walking out, Bob, I'm not sure that was exactly the right way to put the point. But I was trying to make a serious point, and you already realize the serious point I was trying to make. I was trying to make the point that it ought to be possible to be a hyphenated British person. That is, to be a Bangladeshi Englishman. But it's not. You can't say that now. Because Britain doesn't yet have this concept of a hyphenated or integrated or a more expanded sense of us, in which Britain and actually other countries in Europe too are caught in this notion that either they have to become entirely separate from us or they have to become exactly like us. And that's not the way a successful immigrant society works. It's not the way the United States works. I am actually, about the United States, relatively optimistic over a period of 20 or 30 years that the current wave of immigration, we are currently having a wave of immigration, mostly from Latin America and from Asia. In the short run, the effect of that is to cause turmoil in America too. I do not mean Americans are without racism, and I don't mean Americans too. Right now, many Americans are upset about these immigrants. My family has been in America since 1640. My family came from England, and we got there very early. And ever since, every 30 years, another group of immigrants have come, and they've upset us terribly. We were just fine, and then the Dutch arrived. Around 1680, the Dutch arrived. And let me tell you, the Dutch are just very difficult to live with. I don't know if you know many Dutch people. They're terrible. We just couldn't get along with them. But then gradually, we began to intermarry with the Dutch, and then we sort of thought, well, we didn't even notice. We just forgot that there were Dutch people. They were just us. And then the Germans arrived. Now, let me tell you, the Germans were really difficult. And the Germans insisted on speaking German, and they only would talk to other Germans, and we were very upset about them. But then gradually, over 20 or 30 years, we began to include the Germans as part of us. And then we forgot that they were different. And just as we'd gotten that settled, who should arrive but the Irish? And the Irish were terrible. My people had been just tormented by these new immigrants arriving all the time. And I don't want to tell you, when the Italians arrived, it was just terrible. There were all these people, and they were singing, and they liked pasta and all that kind of stuff. And then gradually, we began to listen to Frank Sinatra, and we began to watch Joe DiMaggio play baseball, and then we forgot that Italians were different. And then it turns out they're not different. It took 20 or 30 years. And now Americans, I'm trying to get you to see that my people are really the victims of this whole history, right? You understand that I was joking about that. I hope you understand I was joking about that. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a long enough history of immigration, you can see that a society takes time to adjust. But that's the object. And I'm not worried about America. Not because we're nicer, or not because we're smarter, but just because we have in the back of our minds this cultural memory that this is the way it works. I am, frankly, more worried about Europe, and I'm a little bit worried about my favorite European country as to whether it's yet understands the necessary challenge of dealing with ethnic diversity. So last point. As I said, I'm optimistic about religion. Over the last 50 years, Americans have becoming more integrated in religious terms. Even though we're fighting about religion publicly, in personal terms, we're more integrated. We're more likely to intermarry. We're more likely to live together. We're more likely to go to school together across religious lines. The same thing is true, actually, in racial terms. Americans are more likely to intermarry across racial lines. We're more likely to live together, to go to school together across racial lines. So we're becoming more integrated religiously, more integrated racially, but less integrated in social economic terms. More segregated. America is becoming more segregated in economic terms. People today, compared to 50 years ago, are less likely to marry someone from a different social class. Less likely to live next to people who are from a different social class. Less likely to go to school from someone with a different social class. We are becoming a more divided society in economic terms. It's partly because of the growing income gap, but I'm not just talking about the growing income gap. You know, the gap between rich and poor. That's growing in America, and it's growing in most countries. I suspect it's growing in Italy, too, although I don't know that. But I'm not just talking about economic inequality. I'm talking about social inequality. So in America, we have discovered that children from upper middle class backgrounds, children from parents who are well educated and well off, it's basically my grandchildren are just fine. And those kinds of kids from upper class or upper middle class backgrounds today, compared to 25 or 30 years ago, are now, they're more likely to go to church than they used to, more likely to belong to the Scouts, more likely to they spend more time with their parents, they're more self-confident, they're higher in social trust. Kids from upper class backgrounds in America are better off and more civically engaged than those kids used to be. But kids coming from working class or lower class backgrounds in America are much less likely to go to church than working class kids used to. Much less likely to spend time with their parents than kids like that used to. Much less likely to belong to the Scouts or to other organizations. Much less likely to be involved in civic life. Much less self-confident about their own abilities. And much, much, much lower in social trust. And all the things that I've just mentioned, religious involvement, civic involvement, social trust, time with parents, all of those things are themselves causes of success. So what I'm trying to summarize this very quickly. Increasingly, how will you do in life in America depends on how smart you were in choosing your own parents. If you were smart and chose parents who were well-educated and high income, you're fine. But if you missed the day when parents were chosen, or you just didn't pay attention when people were choosing parents and you just forgot, so that you got parents who were not well-educated and well-income, you're much less likely to do well in your life. And that fundamentally is not fair. It's fundamentally not fair that people's chances in their own life depend on their choice of their parents. Americans, unlike some Europeans, are not bothered by great inequality of income. We're quite happy to have Bill Gates or other wealthy people get wealthy. We don't care how high the ladder is, as long as everybody is getting on the ladder at about the same point. But if increasingly, as our data suggest, people are getting on the ladder at different points, that my grandchildren are getting on the ladder up here, but that the other people with kids with less well-off parents and grandparents are getting on the ladder lower, that's not fair. And this is, at least in the United States, I believe, the most important social public problem facing America going forward. I am worried about America becoming more and more two Americas, a well-off America and a less well-off America. And that needs to be addressed as a serious public problem. So, as you can see from my career, I have often played a role of Cassandra, that is, warning about terrible trends that were likely to strike the United States. Sometimes I was wrong, sometimes I was right, and then it turned out that America had the internal resources to address those problems. And I am, like many Americans, basically optimistic. But I do think social reformers in America have their work cut out for them if we are to continue to be, and I think the same thing is true in other countries, we need to be much more engaged, not just in politics as a party activity, but in thoughtful social reform, paying attention to basic democratic and human values. You've been a terrifically tolerant audience for listening to this long discourse in English. Thank you very much. May I just say one word? I did not notice that another of my friends who's been helpful to me in my career is sitting at this end. Giuliano Amato, thank you very much for your presence. I'm sorry that I missed your entrance.